Although they are currently undefeated and sit at number 2 in the rankings, is it possible that the Notre Dame Fighting Irish are underrated? They're one of the best teams in college football and have been for the last few seasons, but it doesn't feel like we hear as much about them as we should. Over the last 4 years, they've been one of the best teams in college football. Brian Kelly has been one of the best coaches, and Ian Book has been one of the best quarterbacks. However, they're all extremely underrated. Today, we're going to be talking about Notre Dame football and their crazy and underappreciated 4-year run that they're currently on. But before we get to today's video, please take a second and smash that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. About 85% of you who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so if you love college football, this is definitely the place for you. As I mentioned, Notre Dame is currently undefeated and the number 2 team in the country. They're likely going to be going to the college football playoff this season, and they have a chance to win the ACC next week. After a disastrous 2016 season in which they went 4-8, Notre Dame has now won 10+ games in 4 straight seasons for the first time in Notre Dame's historic program history. During this incredible run, they've gone 43-6. Ian Book went undefeated as a starting quarterback at home and became the first Notre Dame quarterback to win 30 games. They've had 1 playoff berth and likely will have a second this season. They defeated the number 1 team in the country in 2020. They've won the Citrus and Camping World Bowl, gone 12-2 against their main rivals, including a very impressive 3-0 record against USC. Oh, and they've reached the conference championship in their likely only season as a member of the ACC conference. So when did this massive turnaround take place? Well, we gotta go back and take a look at that 2016 season I mentioned earlier. The Irish finished the 2016 campaign 4-8, their worst season in nearly a decade. It was shocking to see them finish with only 4 wins, as they won 10 games the previous year. Although 2016 was a disaster, they definitely should not have been a 4-win team, to say the least. They began the season ranked number 10 in the AP poll, and opened the season on the road at Texas. I'm sure you all remember that game, the 2 overtime thriller in which the Longhorns won, and Texas was officially back. After winning the next week, Notre Dame was sitting at 500 on the year. They welcomed the number 12 Michigan State Spartans to town and lost by 8 points. This would be the last time all season Notre Dame would be ranked in the top 25. The following week, Notre Dame fell to Duke thanks to a game-winning field goal by the Blue Devils with a minute remaining. All of a sudden, Notre Dame was 1-3 on the season, with losses coming by 3 points, 8 points, and 3 points again. After winning to get to 2-3, the Irish lost by a touchdown to NC State in one of the craziest weather games in recent memory. Do you guys remember that game where players couldn't even run a few yards before slipping on the wet turf? Notre Dame then lost the following week to Stanford. Just like that, Notre Dame was sitting at 2-5 on the season. Had a few things gone their way, this was a team that easily could have been 7-0 or at least 6-1. Brian Van Gorder was relieved of his duties as defensive coordinator. Defensive analyst Greg Hudson took over as the Irish's defensive coordinator for the rest of the season. This wasn't the end of brutal losses though for the Irish. They lost by 1 point at home to Navy and lost by 3 at home to Virginia Tech. They had 7 losses on the season, with each loss coming by an average of 4.5 points. Again, through 11 games, the Irish easily could have had at least 8 or 9 wins. Instead, they had only 4. They ended their season with an 18-point loss to USC, their biggest loss of the season. After a horrendous season, Brian Kelly was all of a sudden on the hot seat. Notre Dame decided to keep him as their head coach, and things quickly turned around the following year. Though Notre Dame could have won a lot more games in 2016, they were about middle of the pack in offense and defense. They averaged the 53rd most points a game, and their defense allowed the 66th most points. They turned that around drastically in 2017, averaging the 24th most points in the country and allowing fewer points than 100 other teams. The Irish brought in Chip Long to be their new offensive coordinator, and they brought in Mike Elko to be their new defensive coordinator. After winning the first game of the season, Notre Dame lost to Georgia by 1 point thanks to a Bulldogs field goal with 3 minutes remaining. It was a new year, but it looked like the same heartbreaking results would be in place for the Irish. After that loss, Notre Dame was unranked once again and was sitting at 1-1 in the season. But just like that, things completely flipped around for them. The Irish went on to win 7 consecutive games and climbed all the way up to number 3 in the AP poll. During this win streak, Notre Dame was averaging more than 43 points a game, one of the top marks in the entire country. Their defense was transformed as well, as they were allowing fewer than 20 points a game during that stretch. Their streak came to an end on November 11th when they lost on the road to the 7th-ranked Miami Hurricanes. They bounced back the following week though with a win over Navy, but fell a week later on the road at number 20 Stanford. Notre Dame was invited to play in the Citrus Bowl on New Year's Day, facing the 16th-ranked LSU Tigers. The Irish pulled away late thanks to a last-minute Miles Boykin 55-yard touchdown. touchdown. After a disastrous 2016 season in which the Irish won only 4 games, they turned things around by winning 10 games, including a season-ending victory in the Citrus Bowl. Just like that, Notre Dame was back, and this was the start of one of the best runs we've seen in college football over the last few years. Defensive coordinator Mike Elko, who had just spent his first season with Notre Dame, opted to take his talents to Texas A&M 3 days after the Citrus Bowl. However, rather than make an outside hire to replace Elko, Brian Kelly chose to stay in-house, elevating linebackers coach Clark Lee to defensive coordinator. 1 week following Elko's departure, the Irish would suffer another significant coaching loss as Harry Highstand accepted the offensive line coach position on Matt Nagy's staff with the Chicago Bears. In a surprise decision and after a national search, head coach Brian Kelly chose to promote senior offensive analyst Jeff Quinn to replace Highstand. The Irish began the season at number 12 in the polls and welcomed number 14 Michigan into South Bend for arguably the biggest game of the season for the Irish. In an epic Week 1 battle, Notre Dame came out victorious, defeating the Wolverines by 2 touchdowns. The Irish won their next 2 games against Ball State and Vanderbilt, but they were only one-score victories against some pretty bad teams. Notre Dame was 3-0 and ranked number 8 in the country, but Brian Kelly decided to make a bold move with the program. He decided to bench starting quarterback Brandon Wimbush, opting to go with backup quarterback Ian Book. Safe to say, it's a decision that has paid off so far. Ian Book rushed for 43 yards and threw for 325 yards, more passing yards in a single game than Wimbush ever had. And the entire Irish offense had a monstrous performance, blowing out Wake Forest by 30 points. Ian Book would remain the starter as the following week, the Irish welcomed number 7 Stanford into town. He threw for just under 300 yards with 4 touchdowns in the biggest game of his young career. This was the moment Notre Dame knew they had their quarterback of the future. In addition to Book's incredible performance, Dexter Williams rushed for 160 yards, and Notre Dame's defense limited the Stanford offense to just 10 total first downs, as the number 8 Fighting Irish took down the Stanford Cardinal by 21 points in the first top 10 matchup at Notre Dame Stadium since 2005. This was only the beginning for Notre Dame, as they just kept winning. They won their first 12 games of the season, adding victories against number 24 Virginia Tech, number 12 Syracuse, and on the road against their number 1 rival, USC. After a 10-win season, Notre Dame answered with a historic 12-0 campaign, putting them all the way up at number 3 in the college football playoff poll. For the first time ever, Notre Dame was selected to compete in the college football playoff. Notre Dame faced Clemson in the Cotton Bowl, with the winner advancing to play in the national championship. Through the first quarter, the Irish defense looked good as they had held a high-powered Clemson offense to only 3 points. With the game tied at 3, the Irish were only 3 great quarters away from advancing. Sadly, they didn't get the 3 great quarters they needed. The Irish went scoreless the rest of the way and allowed the Tigers to score 20 points in the second quarter, putting the game out of reach. Notre Dame ended up losing the game 30-3, and they were eliminated from the college football playoff. Notre Dame continued to improve from there, as in 2019 they finished in the top 15 in both offense and defense. The Irish jumped off to a hot start yet again, beginning the season 2-0 and moving up to number 7 in the AP poll. The team had built great confidence heading into a primetime matchup on the road against the number 3 Georgia Bulldogs. It was there that Notre Dame experienced their first loss of the season, losing by 6 points. After this loss, the Irish answered right back with a 3-game winning streak that included wins over number 18 Virginia and their rivals USC. When Notre Dame traveled to the Big House to take on Michigan the following week, they experienced one of their most embarrassing losses in the storied history of the rivalry, as they lost by 31 points. Though the conditions weren't ideal, the loss sealed the fate for the Irish that night, as well as their hopes of a return to the college football playoff. This would be the final loss on the season though for Notre Dame, as they won their next 6 games to finish the season 11-2. They defeated Iowa State by 24 points in the Camping World Bowl. For the 3rd consecutive season, Notre Dame had won at least 10 games, and this was their 2nd bowl win in 3 years. Due to restrictions on non-conference games being enforced by the Power 5 conferences in light of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US, it was announced that Notre Dame would play an ACC schedule for the 2020 season. After the cancellation of the Wake Forest game scheduled for December 12th by the ACC, due to an evaluation of the 3 teams in contention to play in the ACC championship game, Notre Dame officially clinched a spot in the ACC title in their first year playing in the conference. The Irish cruised all year as they started the season at number 10. Their biggest game of the season came on November 7th when they welcomed the number 1 Clemson Tigers to town. In a thrilling game, Ian Book and the Irish shocked the Tigers, defeating them in double overtime. After this win, Notre Dame won their next 3 and currently sit at 10-0 on the season and are the number 2 team in the country. As I mentioned earlier, they'll play in the ACC title game next weekend, a rematch against the Clemson Tigers. For the last 4 years, Notre Dame has quietly been one of the best teams in all of college football. As I mentioned, they've won at least 10 games in 4 straight years for the first time in the history of the storied program. Ian Book has been arguably the best Notre Dame quarterback they've ever had, as he's thrown for 8,500 yards with 72 passing touchdowns while rushing for 1,500 yards and 16 rushing touchdowns. Not only are those unseen numbers from a Notre Dame quarterback, he's one of only a handful of college quarterbacks to ever have those numbers for their career. Oh, and Brian Kelly, who was on the hot seat and close to losing his job just a few years ago, well, he's silenced the doubters and proven that he's one of the best coaches college football has to offer. Over the last 4 years, Notre Dame has had 19 players drafted into the NFL and will have more this upcoming season. 9 of those players were drafted within the first 2 rounds. They have 11 wins over ranked opponents, more than most teams in all of college football during that span. Regardless of what happens next week against Clemson, Notre Dame is in a really good spot and will likely be returning to the college football playoff. Whatever happens in the playoff, this season will still be considered a success for Notre Dame. Moving to a brand new conference and going 10-0 is no easy task, and the Irish did it with ease. So, what are your guys' thoughts on Notre Dame and how dominant they've been over the last 4 years? Do you think this Irish team is the best we've seen in recent memory? Drop a comment down below and share with me your thoughts. If there's another team you'd like me to dive deep into, drop a comment and share who you'd like to see a video on next. If you haven't done so yet, please take a second and give this video a like, as it really helps share the video with other college football fans. Also, make sure you smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you never miss another video. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.